I'm so pleased to join, to take part in this Economist Roundtable in Athens. I want to thank you for the invitation and for the hospitality, and I am so pleased to share my views together with my friends, Mr. Bakayonis and President Michel. I'm sure many of you know we work together, both of us prime ministers, and we have our relation very much that time. And Prime Minister Michel, when he was Prime Minister also, he was very much helpful. The past 2 days have seen heavy diplomatic traffic in Ankara. You follow this. Decision of consequences have been taken at the NATO summit. The future of the alliance is being reshaped. There is now much talk about NATO version 3.0. The participation of President Trump to the Ankara summit was meaningful in bridging the gap between Europe and America. I hope that face-to-face meeting, being togetherness, melted the ice. Alongside NATO, the future of Europe is at a crossroads. It's time to take bold steps. In this spirit, the relations between Turkey and the EU need to be re-examined and revived. First of all, we should agree that Turkey is geographically, politically, historically, and culturally a part of Europe. Therefore, after the Second World War, Turkey became the founder member of all the European institutions. And we also have a long history with the European Union. When the European Union was European Common Market in 1960s, we made our first agreement, signed agreements, and in a way we became the part of also that organization. And we joined the custom union in 1995, before even becoming the officially candidate country. So this was a unique case, and we removed all the barriers between the customs. Almost 20 years ago, first as a prime minister, then as a foreign minister, I drove the Turkish accession process to EU that time. And I fondly remember our hard work to adopt the Copenhagen political criteria, master criteria. We changed constitutions, we changed laws, and we adopted. And at the end, the Commission declared that Turkey sufficiently met the criteria. Then we start the accession negotiation officially on June 2005, and in that table I was the foreign minister at that time. Since then, we know that long time passed, and we know the problems, difficulties. To be honest, seeing the current state of affairs and relations is saddening. Both sides have made mistakes, but things could have been different. We now must be realistic and look at the present. Today, Turkey's full membership with the EU does not look likely and realistically. I have to say this with a very sad feeling, because I spent too much effort, and really, we did silent revolutions in our country, changed many things during that time. And now when I look at the current affairs, this is my observation. Talking too much about the full membership is not realistic. So what should we do? But we have to think it again. First of all, Brexit made it even difficult. Without the United Kingdom, EU cannot integrate Turkey also. The capacity is not the same when the UK was in EU. So we need to work on a model between Turkey and the EU, such as Norway's. I always defended this and supported and talk about that Turkey could be like Norway without being the full member, but in the same umbrella. Integration of Turkey with the EU on some fundamental topics is necessary. These are the economy and trade, security and defense, and people-to-people relations, especially in culture and education. Now, if I want to say a few words on economy.
Very briefly, just because
okay,
we're in
just
minus territory.
Okay. Turkey should become a full member of common market. The relations needs to be honest. Custom union agreement needs to be updated. For instance, when the EU signs free trade deals with third countries, Turkey faces disadvantages. The third country benefits from Turkey's custom union to the EU, but Turkey does not have that advantage. You know, the President knows these things very well. We, at the time where economic protections are rising, the full integration of Ankara into the EU economy is to the advantage of the both sides. Now, our foreign trade with EU is almost $250 billion. It's almost 50%. And most of the foreign investments in Turkey comes from the EU. This means that EU's companies are functioning in Turkey. So you own the companies in Turkey and you benefit from them. So it is good for both of us. Therefore, strengthening the economic relations, strengthening, it's not only the trade, also the other areas, is actually good for both of us. Defense and security.
Can we come back to defense and security maybe
yes,
in the discussion?
Yeah, I came to that. When it comes to security and defense, the importance of Turkey for the EU is obvious. The interest of the United States is Europe. Security is decreasing. It is attention shifting towards the domestic issues and Indo-Pacific. So therefore, we need the strong European security architect. For this, EU, it should not be limited with just EU members. Of course, it's a choice of persons. If you decide that, no, as an EU, we are enough ourselves, then you have to think to challenge the problems. But what is good is this: United Kingdom, Turkey, Norway. We are at the three corners of the Europe. All of us together, EU, then we will have a very strong security architect in Europe. So therefore, this is essential, and being togetherness is indispensable for me.
Shall we
Well,
hand
I think I
over to
will-
Mr.
I-
Michel? We
okay,
will
I
come
see.
back.
Okay.
There'll be an
Oh, all right,
opportunity
okay.
to come back. But thank you so much for that. And I'm sure Mr. Michel wants to respond. And I think Mr. Yule focused very much on the present and the future and where the relationship might go from here and what are the key areas of cooperation. So I just want to hear your response to that and how you see things.
Oh, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be today with all of us. But first, let me start by telling you that we face a paradox. On the one hand, the world is more multipolar than ever, and on the other hand, multilateralism is weaker than ever. And because before I come to the question related to Turkey and the EU, I would like to share briefly some comments about this global picture. In fact, I see four dynamics, four criteria, four factors which are shaping the current international state of play, the current international situation. Point one, the fierce race between China and the United States, and it affects all of us, between the Middle Empire and the American first ambition, this race to be or to stay number one, it has an impact on all of us, point one. Point two, we can see that there are more and more military conflicts as we speak. Half of the world is involved in a military conflict directly or indirectly beyond their borders. That's a unique situation since World War II. And it means that the rule of law is once again replaced by the rule of force. We see unilateral action, coercion, intimidation. Point three, we see new battlefields. Of course, it's not new. We can see that territories, natural resources, we fight. We struggle to have some access to more resources. What is new is the impact of the new technologies, AI, data, quantum, and the hybrid threats, disinformation, the use of fake news, complotists, terrorists, and by the way, for the EU, that's a serious challenge because we can see our democracies put under pressure from inside and from outside. And finally, the fourth element I'm observing with you is the rise of middle powers. That's fascinating. That's very interesting to observe countries or regions which more and more ambitions, which more and more self-confidence, and the will in those countries, in those regions, to promote their principles, to promote their values, and to make agreements case by case, interest by interest. And it means that in those countries, in those regions, the purpose is not necessarily to follow one single superpower. This is what we are observing. And I'm making those observations. Why? Because in this context, because there is this systemic shift. We don't know every day who is our friend and who is not our friend anymore. In this context, I think that the European strategic autonomy, the European sovereignty, has to be the political priority for this political generation. And what does it mean in a nutshell? It means that first point, we have to invest much more in the field of our economic basis. We have to strengthen our competitiveness. We have strength. We have vulnerabilities. We have to regulate in a better way. I think we regulate too fast, too much. There is too much bureaucracy within the EU, point one. We need to unleash the vast potential of the single market through more ambitious structural investments. And we have some issues related to the fragmentation of our capital markets within the EU. 27 fragmented capital markets. That's a weakness. We need to implement the capital market union. And I think the European Investment Bank is a powerful tool. In the future, I hope it will be the starting point for a true European sovereign fund to make strategic choices in the future. Point two. 1 minute.
1 minute, yeah.
Point two, security and defense. And here I see some areas for collaboration within the EU and with countries outside of the EU. And finally, we need reliable partnerships. We need trusted partners. And here comes my thoughts, my comments about this relationship between the EU and Turkey. You know, in my previous responsibilities, I had the responsibility to coordinate the debates among the leaders, the head of state, the head of government, in the European Council. And I remember many meetings related to the relationship between the EU and Turkey. And I see the difficulties, I see the challenges, I see the differences, because we have some differences with Turkey, but I also see some opportunities, especially in the current context, because of the criteria I was mentioning before. One or two comments, and then I end my comment at this stage. First, I agree that probably there is a misunderstanding, deliberately or not, I don't know, because if the framework for our collaboration is the EU accession process, it makes our debates a bit more difficult. Why? Because it supposes this framework that on the EU side we have the hope, we have that idea that Turkey should be very close to our principles, our values, our fundamental ideas about how our institutions should work and should be. And I'm not certain that's the case. I don't blame anyone, but there are differences in that field. If the framework is a very ambitious strategic partnership, then it could be a different approach, because then it means that we have to manage in a responsible way our differences, sometimes our disputes, and to identify positive areas where we can cooperate. And I would like to end by saying that I think that the path followed by Prime Minister Mitsotakis is the right one. On the one hand, he is firm on the principles, on some fundamental values and interests. On the other hand, there is a channel of communication open to identify some areas where it's possible in the field of connectivity, investments, in the field of migration, to cooperate, to coordinate, and to have a more positive agenda between that country and Turkey.
Okay, thank you. Before I come to Dora, I suppose you know, what you said does beg the question. You said that you think the approach pursued by the Greek government over the past few years is the right one. And if you are agreeing with Mr. Gül that the existing accession process is not really appropriate for Turkey, then what is a realistic framework for cooperation? What can be achieved today between the EU and Turkey beyond that accession process?
Two comments. First one, I'm saying today, that's not the appropriate framework. I don't know what will be the situation in 10 years, in 20 years, I don't know. But today, I am not certain that's the appropriate framework, point one. But point two, I think it's possible to develop a very ambitious framework in terms of collaboration, coordination, in terms of common interest. I have plenty of examples in mind, of course, in the field of connectivity, in the field of resources, in the field of defense. We need an architecture for the European security. And I can see in recent months more and more projects involving private companies within the EU with Turkish companies. And I think if we want to go further in that field, trust will be key, because in the field of defense, you need trust to work together and to develop projects together. It means that there's a lot that can be done in terms of collaboration. But let me be honest and sincere with you. Based on this experience, I also do not underestimate the difficulties because of those tensions, those disputes between Turkey and Cyprus, and because of the diverging views on that situation. And sometimes in my interaction with my colleagues in Turkey, I had the impression that there was a kind of underestimation of what is the impact on the relationship between the EU. And including a certain time ago, a few weeks ago, when the European Union makes a statement saying that the relationship between Cyprus and Turkey is central in the relationship between the EU and Turkey. That's not an anecdote. That's a very powerful message sent by the EU.
Okay, we'll come back to Cyprus, but I must bring in now Dora and to make some opening remarks and reflections on what you've heard from the
Now, allow me first, thank you, John. Allow me first to welcome President Gül and President Michel in Athens. President Gül, with whom I had the chance to cooperate as a foreign minister, has been for decades an influential voice of moderation and common sense in Turkey and the region. And President Michel has been crucial in the EU's response to a series of crises, spanning from COVID to Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So it's a real privilege to share the same panel with these two gentlemen. Now, dear colleagues, there is a basic principle in philosophy called horror vacui. Nature hates vacuums. The exact same principle applies to geopolitics. It is evident that the US, for the last many years, retreats from Europe. We heard these days President Trump threatening a full removal of all US soldiers from European soil. That means a vacuum of security is being created, and something needs to fill this vacuum, especially when Russia threatens directly the sovereignty of European countries. In the minds of many Europeans, that something might be Turkey. President Erdogan promises Europe an attractive package: military muscle for hire, political tolerance for bringing soldiers home in coffins, a battle-tested defense industry, direct channels of communication to actors Europe cannot reach, from Russia and Iran to Hezbollah and Hamas. And not least, Erdogan's bromance with Trump. All these have made some European friends to look for other ways when President Erdogan puts in jail leaders of the opposition, journalists, and even comedians, or when he demolishes freedom of speech, rule of law inside Turkey, or even when he keeps under occupation a member state of the European Union, or threatens with war another one when he promises to take control of Jerusalem. For Europeans, once again in its history, Turkey is seen as an unpleasant necessity. All this works in theory. The problem is that geopolitics doesn't happen in a lab. It happens in the real world, and the two presidents beside me know that firsthand. I remember President Gül calling publicly for moderation during the process of the Gezi Park in 2013. I remember him saying that democracy does not mean elections alone. I remember his warnings about judicial independence and his objections to the so-called internet law in Turkey. They were all warning signs from a man who genuinely cared about democracy in his country and who could see it slipping away. And I remember, of course, all the efforts President Michel made to break over-dependence of Russian fossil fuels once the war in Ukraine broke out. You see, during the decades before the war, many European leaders in Berlin and elsewhere viewed Russia in a similar way to how many European leaders view Turkey today, an unpleasant necessity. A country that could provide Europe with something it desperately needed. In Russia's case, cheap energy. In Turkey's case, cheap security. As long as we were willing to look the other way on uncomfortable issues: democracy, concentration of power, imprisonment of opposition, revisionist ambition. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm not saying, and I want to be very clear, that Europe must not do business with Turkey. Greece has been a staunch supporter of Turkish European aspirations for decades. And what President Gül mentioned, I remember very well the time when in 1995, Turkey was making a real effort to meet the Copenhagen criteria. And at the time, I had big fights with President Sarkozy because I supported Turkey and he was against Turkey. And I always said, this is a mistake. If we want to build trust, Turkey has to trust the European Union, and the European Union has to give a clear path to Turkey. Unfortunately, all this has changed today. So I strongly believe, and I will happily elaborate later, Europe and Turkey can have a mutual beneficial agreement which would require both parties to respect the rules of the game. In fact, I believe that the only way to ensure our relationship with Turkey does not become the same catastrophic fiasco of our relationship with Russia is to be open, clear, stick to our values, make Turkey understand that the rules of the game demand respect of international law, good neighborly relations, and good strategic commitment. And I'm profoundly sure that this is the only way to go forward. If Europe makes the same mistake with Turkey as we made with Russia, the price will be too high to pay. So clear messages, clear rules, clear commitments is, in my way, the only way forward. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Dora. Well, I'm put the same question to you because you've given a very, very clear message there. Stick to principles, values, and so on. Existing framework, then I assume that you agree that the existing framework, what has been achieved in the past, not to discount it, not to say that it wasn't important, but we need something new. We need some new kind of framework for cooperation. Not just between Greece and Turkey, but
No, between Europe and Turkey. And
yes,
I think
so
this is extremely important.
Practically, how?
President Michel said before that we have the Cyprus issue. Yes, we have the Cyprus issue. It's there. Cyprus is a member of the European Union. Greece is threatened for war. It is a member of the European Union. Why can't we not go on? Make Turkey understand that it's for her benefit if these positions are changed. Let me be more clear. Turkey has big borders. She has problems with all the neighbors. The only borders where Turkey is absolutely secure are the western borders with Greece. This is a message which we have to understand. But what we cannot accept would be a European policy which does not take in account Greece's or Cyprus' not only sensitivities, but real problems which we still have. I'm always, for years, President Gül knows that very well, and I think most of the people who are listening to me today know that I'm a fervent supporter of Greek-Turkish dialogue all my life. I have more attacks than I can count because of that. But the message from Europe now, John, must be clear. We cannot look around making a strategic deal with Turkey, which I understand some of our partners want to do, strategic deal with Turkey, and forgetting all the other issues. It'd be bad for the European Union, we would pay a cost, but it would be bad also for Turkish democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. So we only have 5 minutes, unfortunately, now before we have to break for coffee, but obviously I want to give Mr. Yıldız the opportunity to respond to these points and then maybe take all of you briefly for final comments.
Well, first of all, I am a realistic man. That's why I said accession is not likely. I know our shortcomings, but let's to be honest, when we were best, when the whole Europe, the world were appreciating us, our reforms, when the democratic standards, economic standards, financial standards were at the same level with Copenhagen and Maastricht criteria. During those years, our accession negotiation was blocked. So we have to be honest. I know the problems of today, but when we were not having any problem, just appreciation and support from many real, sincere friends from the outside Europe and in the world, our accession negotiations were blocked. I was telling my counterparts that time that don't block our accession negotiation. You will just watch and we will adopt all EU acquis. At the end, when the Commission says that, yes, Turkey is ready, then you take your political decision. We will respect. Even some, not all, of course, some of the leaders that time, even that time, they did not allow us to adopt the EU acquis by blocking. So the honesty comes first. As far as the Cyprus issue, Cyprus is the real problem, of course. It's blocking everything. From the very beginning, I always tell that let's solve and get rid of this. Not myself, President Erdogan took very bold step to say the yes to Annan and EU together. You introduced that plan together. It was a UN plan, but European Union, you endorsed it. You were thinking that the island should join the Union without any problem, solving the border problem. Because this is one of the main principles of EU, that before joining, you should solve everything. As Croatia did, you forced Croatia to solve this problem. You know, I mean, no need to repeat. It came to the referendum, and in the referendum, Turkey said yes, the other side said no. So the problem was brought inside. For that, I think we should not be blamed. We know Cyprus is the member of EU, of course. And, we agreed all this in 2004, 2005, and during those crucial meetings. So here, it is the real honesty. But anyway, what happened in the past, just leave them. The world is changing. Geopolitics is changing. Enemies and friends are changing in this world. Look at the President of America, his approach to the issues. His threat perception is very much different. So in this world, if the EU is thinking that Turkey should be kept out in all the field, forget the full membership, in the field of security, in the field of economic cooperation, in the field of culture and others, if it is good for Europe, then of course, I mean, we cannot say anything. But I believe that we should be together. I believe that it is beneficial for the both sides. I believe that both sides will win. If we separate our ways, then the both sides will lose. That's what I believe. So therefore, I pointed out these particular three topics. The economy, trade, and defense are very essential to test its sincerity.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, but I want to give the two interlocutors a chance to respond. I don't want to revisit the referendum question. We discussed it yesterday, and I think the positions were put very clearly from the Greek side and in response when that was raised yesterday. But just to give you to come back now on what you've heard. and maybe to just say very briefly where you see the avenues of cooperation in the fields that Mr. Yule has outlined in economy and defense and so on. Realistically,
very
practically.
briefly. But first of all, I agree on a lot of things that was said by my colleague. But on my side, I don't put in the same basket Russia and Turkey. That's my first point. My second point is the following. A few hours ago, in the NATO summit, the President of the United States once again threatened Greenland. That's the world we live in. And it means indeed
He did what, sorry?
threatens to take Greenland.
Take Greenland, okay.
And that's the world we live in, a very complicated world. And in this world, indeed, I have the impression that we should ask ourselves what is a good deal at the international level. For me, a good deal is a win-win deal. It doesn't mean that we can solve everything immediately, but it means that we have to manage in a responsible way our differences, point one, and to identify some areas where we can cooperate in a constructive manner. And I think that's the path that we are trying to follow. And a lot will depend, of course, on the decisions that will be made within the EU, but also on the decisions that are made or will be made in Turkey. And the more it will be possible to make progress in managing in a responsible way our differences, and maybe one day in fixing our problems, the more we will develop this strategic collaboration with Turkey. And finally, my hope is that this Mediterranean Sea and the countries in that region will be more and more in the future a bridge between Europe and Africa, between Europe and the Middle East.
Thank you. Dora, very briefly, because we have to go to coffee break.
No, I just wanted to ask President Gül one question. Do you think...
Oh, we can't have more questions.
Okay.
Sorry.
Let me say, I still hope that viewing the change which happens in the world, that Turkish policy will change, that she will try sincerely to adapt to the European norms. President Michel disagrees with me between Russia and Turkey. Revisionist positions, Mr. President, are very well known by Turkey. I mean, everybody knows them. So what we would like is for this to change, so that the casus belli is forgotten, so that the revisionist statements are not existing anymore. And then the whole atmosphere would be completely different. And that's what I mean. Because today, you in Belgium or in Paris do not feel it, but ask the rest of Eastern Europe. So let me just finish by saying we have an example of good cooperation. Good cooperation with the visas in our islands. More than 2 million Turks come to the islands. And on immigration, we managed to have a good cooperation. Now, this would be possible for all issues. Let's just try to persuade the Turkish leadership that it's worth it.